Hello, everyone, and welcome to the introductory lecture for Comparative Criminology. Um, so this normally takes up at least one lecture day in my face-to-face class, and I'm not going to spend nearly that much time here. I am going to point you towards some authors that if you're really interested in this kind of origins of how did we start cooperating, you can go off and look at those authors. But I think this lecture will give you enough of a taste that it'll make sense of kind of how this all began. So the idea in comparative criminology is if you know one system, you really don't know any systems at all because there's no context. You kind of just know your own history. So we're all very well versed in American justice and how we got here. But that doesn't really tell us the story of how did humans start working together? How did we start coming up with the concept of justice in the first place? And then how come China looks so different than Japan, and Japan looks different than India? And that's the whole basis of this class. Why do the systems look different? So that's what we're going to go through. So when we ask ourselves, what did we originally start looking like when we were cooperating and working together, we have no idea. There are no original cultures left. Maybe if this was 300 years ago, we could find a tribe in the Amazon someplace, but those are all gone. They all have some kind of modern influence on them. And we have some anthropological writings, but really to figure out what we really look like in the beginning, without a million years intervening, we've got to go to nature. And certainly we can look at whales. Primates are a classic place we can look, but there's an author named Fukuyama who makes an argument that chimpanzees are about the best that we're going to get. Chimps only are one chromosome, a single chromosome different than humans. That's how close we are to them. So he says, well, let's go out and look at what chimps do, and that probably gives us a pretty good analogy of what original humans were like. So let's ask that question. What do chimps do? Well, they live in social groups. Amazingly, they engage in very human activities like having families, engaging in warfare, sharing, going up to the top of the treetops when there's the time of plenty and yelling to everybody, we found this tree over here and there's plenty of food. And yet, in times of famine, going and attacking another tribe and killing all the males, and maybe saving the females to integrate within the tribe. They know about compassion within their groups, and they know about cooperation. If you have one kind of older female that's ought to be in a position of power, but she kind of picks on the little kids when nobody's looking, somehow chimps are able to figure out who that person is, what they're really like, and isolate them. And study after study, we've seen this kind of behavior. So even though they don't have language, they have this understanding of what it takes to be a good leader. And they choose consistently the people who are the best leaders. We also have this idea of mirroring behavior. What I want, I show, because then I know that I get that back. Anything I give, any cooperation I give, I get back. And it's generally speaking, probably for humans too at this stage, even though I give some things up, all in all, the transaction is beneficial for me. And it's really easy to keep people from cheating. You know who the deceitful people are. You know who the ones who aren't going to cooperate. Now, as we get bigger, that gets harder. Fortunately for humans, we can engage in reciprocity, and we can communicate who is engaging and who is cheating. And so it works for us beyond a family group. We can actually belong in like these tribal segmented cultures. And because we are doing these good things and bad things, and we begin to understand on a normative level what we consider to be good and bad, we start to notice when we are cooperating and doing good and good things happen, we assign a causation to that. And sometimes this causation also gets associated with things that happen in nature as well. So we end up with totemism. That's one kind of religion that we get early on. But we also begin to remember who the good leaders were, and we worship those ancestors. And this is really important because what it does is it gives us someone to observe our good behavior and bad behavior. So now we're not just enforcing our own society because we can see who cheats and who doesn't. Now there's somebody supernatural up there who's watching. It's like the elf on the shelf or, Santa Claus. Somebody's watching when you're sleeping and when you're awake. And that makes us perform better. The other thing about ancestor worship is there's a duty not only to who's behind you, but also to who's in front of you. Many cultures have this idea of a string that's suspended over a blade. And as long as you act right, you can keep the string suspended above the blade. But if you act wrong, use poor judgment, act poorly, the string touches the blade and cuts, and all those future generations never are born. So you have this duty both to your ancestor and also to those who come after you. So in the story of Cain and Abel, for instance, in the original text, it says that God came to Cain and said, "Hey, where's your brother?" And Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper? I have no idea." And God says, "His bloods is crying out to me from the soil." He uses the plural, his bloods. And so the rabbinic tradition says that God was telling Cain, all of his future children that you have wiped out are also calling to me. So that's kind of the idea. This makes larger societies possible. If you want a really interesting discussion of this, see Jared Diamond's The World Until Yesterday, where he talks about this. This isn't necessarily the end-all of culture. He talks about when the Dutch took over, that you would have to ask yourself whether or not that was a good thing for a Western culture to come in and kind of wipe out a traditional culture. But within about 10 years after the Dutch took over and they'd outlawed feuds, if you talk to the common man and asked them whether that was a good thing or not, they would tell you it was a really, really good thing, because by introducing this other layer of this conception of a government, somebody who could tell you what to do, it made it safer. So one old man said he liked the fact that he could get up in the morning and go out and use the bathroom without fearing that someone was waiting to kill him. Getting to be older myself, I can sympathize with that. Sometimes in the morning, the last thing you want to think about is whether or not somebody's waiting for you with a rock to bash over your head. So as we get bigger and we can communicate and we have this religious ethos, we develop this idea of segmented societies. And really, like Diamond said, the world until yesterday was like this. It looked like this. It was very tribal. So we had these little subgroups. See these little subgroups in these tribes that went all the way down to, say, a father or an uncle, that everybody shared lineage, and everybody, even if you were on a feudal estate, you might not share lineage with the Lord, but you swore an ownership or an oath to them. And every once in a while, the king would come in and say, I need your help. We need to go fight a crusade. We need to go fight a war. These guys are on our border trying to attack. And all the segments would join together, and they'd form an army, and they'd go out and fight. And then as soon as they were done, they'd break back up and go to their farms. And this was really the world until yesterday. That's how we organized ourselves. So now that still doesn't really explain why some areas of the world are different, because so far, everywhere we look around the world tended to follow this pattern. Let's look at China. Now here's a really good example of why China probably develops the way it does compared to everywhere else. China is bounded on all sides by some kind of daunting geographical structure. Deserts on the north, mountains, big mountains on the west, and of course the ocean. And a pretty harsh ocean. The Pacific Ocean is not just some pond. It's a big, cold ocean. And so if you have a dictator, a tyrant, where do you go? There's no place to go. You can't run. So the culture tended to be pretty stable. Now, in contrast, look at everywhere else. If you're in India and you get a tyrant, well, you just cross over the Punjab, or you migrate, and vice versa. If you're in Africa and you have a famine, you walk across the continent until you get somewhere else. So when we look at, in the next couple of slides, we look at how China develops with these dynasties. See, originally, they've kind of got coexisting dynasties, but you get down to the Qing dynasty, and finally, one dynasty wins out against everybody else. And still today, this form of kind of empire type of government is still represented in the communist system. In the next slide, I'll show you how that works. But in this system, then you have an empire, you have an emperor at the top, and then it's spread out over a large area. And so you need some kind of consistent way. And they arrived on this system, which is kind of different than the segmented system. In their system, they said, we're going to go out all over the country. We're going to test students, and whoever the smartest and brightest students are, we're going to bring them into this kind of new tribe of the Mandarins, and we're going to teach them to be administrators and teachers and agriculture experts, and then they're going to administer the empire. So this is different than anywhere else. So what you end up with then is a system that has very little outward competition. It's not dynamic in that respect at all. So it tends to be more inward focused, both on a national level and a macro level, and also on a micro level. So you end up with a philosophy and a religion that says you should be content with your place, you need to be efficient, you need to honor your ancestors, not to break tradition, don't embarrass the family or the country, high levels of achievement, because we also have this Mandarin system that you want to try to get your kid into. That is how you can improve your family position, ultimately. So it's little wonder when we look at China today, when we see a modern China that looks the way it does with this system. Now let's turn our eye then to the Indo-European way. Now remember I talked about how easy it was to just migrate away from a tyrant. Well, the same thing happened with armies. It was easy to invade. So you have lots of cross-pollination that goes on. You got, this is Alexander's march, here on the left side. And then on the right side, this is the Mongols invading in. So this is a dynamic thing that's constantly going on. So it tends to make it so you don't have one tyrant that can exist. You've got lots and lots of regimes that flip over and change quite a bit. But that means you got a lot of governmental experimentation, lots of social experimentation. So you end up with these kind of cross-pollination, particularly when you add religion into the mold. So you've got this kind of, at the top here, this influence from Jerusalem, which is the Old Testament, God, Judeo-Christianity of religion and philosophy. You cross-pollinate that with Greek philosophy, and then you throw in the social structure and law and jurisprudence of Rome. And all these things together give us this kind of unusual mix. I threw in a couple of slides here just so you can see that first Christianity spreads all over what we know of as the European world, and then Islam comes along. Now, interestingly, the whole birth of Jesus and the spread of Christianity and the idea of a Godhead that has three separate individuals of God the Father, God the Son, Jesus, and God the Holy Spirit, leads to a rift within the Christian church. You have the Coptic church down in Egypt that believes that there's only one God, and Jesus was something other than a fragmentation of the Godhead. And so when Islam comes along, the 600s, that whole area is kind of ripe for embracing a monolithic religion that says there's just one God. So we've got these, many traditions here that are mixing to give us what we've got today. We'll talk more about that as we go through class. So we have these cycles, and I didn't come up with this, I'm just spouting it from somebody else, but these cycles really, first it's the cross-pollination of Christianity with Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle, and then you have these second waves, and the second wave comes through, and you've got Thomas Aquinas rediscovering Aristotle. Well, the thing that's interesting about this rediscovery of Aristotle is it infects not just the church, but then it causes him to go back and look at all of the philosophy and law and kind of the way things ought to be organized. And that's really the beginning of civil law also, and the canon law, which becomes the civil law, because he's looking for earlier ideas, and he finds the law of Justinian. When Justinian goes blind, he steps down from being emperor, and he works on codifying the law. Well, Aquinas finds both Aristotle and he finds Justinian law. So this is a major thing that's happening here. So all of this together, it leads us towards eventually having a movement to separate this church and state, which we don't have in the Eastern world. It moves us towards an individual responsibility because you got salvation, right? And as we know from Max Weber, there's probably a connection between this idea of salvation and working to prove that you're worthy and the economic conceptualization of things like property and success and capitalism. Then we also have these ideas of primogeniture, firstborn inheritance. Well, if the firstborn gets everything, so we don't break the farms up, we don't break up the estate, then what do the second sons do? Well, they go and join the military. And what do the third sons do? Well, they join the priesthood. And so you have this kind of three segmentation of society. That's an simplification. But it also aggrandizes the church. You get pretty qualified people going in consistently to the church. Then the other thing that comes along is the church forbids Levantism, which was cousin marriage. If you go to the Islamic world or you go to the early Judaism world, particularly remember the story of Ruth. She is a widow, and she is allowed to marry a cousin because she's a widow. If a brother died, his second brother was expected to take his wife. And the church comes along and the church rejects this. Now, what happens when you reject this? You have older women who probably doesn't get married again, and when she dies, her wealth passes to the church. And so, as a result, women begin to develop rights into this system. And this movement for women to have rights, because of this kind of church influence rejection of Levantism, we start to develop these ideas of individual rights. Other places in the world, we never develop these ideas of individual rights. It's more about society and the conception of taking care of the whole unit and being, but not in the West. In the West, we develop ideas of individual universal rights. Now, what about other narratives? Well, of course, the native First Nation narratives, we can't forget those. I've put some slides in here of the Navajo. The Navajo origin story is the Navajo Nation in prehistory gets kind of messed up. Lots of warring, lots of incest, lots of domestic violence, you name it. They've got it going on. And the gods come and take a boy and a girl away and teach them the right way to live. And the right way to live is within harmony. Harmony to your family, harmony to your neighbor, and harmony with the world. And they develop a religion that is all about preserving harmony, and then when harmony is lost, bringing harmony back. And they have shamans that sing songs that remind people about this communalism and what their duties and responsibilities are. And in the process of the healing song or the blessing song or the marriage song, it's instructive and it's phenomenal of how social norms and social pressure helps people heal. It also gets the wrongs out in the open, and people can forgive one another as well. Next slide has a little bit, actually I skipped a slide, sorry about that. We also have Iroquois influences. America, we can't really understand America unless we understand this Iroquois influence. We didn't have a Western idea of having two cameral legislatures like we do in the United States. You certainly had House of Lords and House of Commons, which is a bicameral legislature. But until recently, the House of Commons didn't have any power. Really, the House of Lords dominated up until the Glorious Revolution, which was almost 1700. So, but if you come to the Iroquois, they have a bicameral legislature based upon the warring, which is the men, and the peace councils, which are the women. And they have equal power and veto over one another. You can't do anything without both votes. This is the origin of the 3 strikes rule. You had a war chief, like what I've pictured here, and if he and his council elected to go to war or elected to do something foolish, they got a couple of chances, and on the 3rd chance, the peace council, the women, deposed the chief and elected a new chief in his place. And we got that from the Iroquois. Separation of powers also is a concept that we get from the Iroquois. Back now to the Navajo Nation, just a couple of slides here of how this conceptualization of peacemaking actually works, where you have your responsibilities to your family and your neighbor and then everyone else, and how it leads to this forgiveness through the process. I won't go into anything further with it. I just included the slide so you could kind of see how that worked. And then the last is so that we're not too Eurocentric or too Western-centric with the United States, we also need to remember that we have some other examples out here, and particularly in New Zealand, the Maori have a talking circle process. This is kind of a governmental process that I've depicted here, but it works all the way down to the micro level of your neighbor has harmed you, and you hold a talking circle, and you get all the uncles and the aunts there of both sides, and whoever's holding the talking stick gets to talk as long as they think that they need to in order to be heard and understood, and then they pass to the next person, and the next person, and to the offender, and to the victim, and it comes all the way back, and the circle goes on as many times as it needs to until people felt like they've been heard. And then, usually, the victim and their group of folks will leave the room, and the offender and his or her family will talk about what needs to be done to restore order. And then they come back together and they make their offer. And usually, everybody says, yes, that's reasonable. And then they have a big celebration afterwards. And so these are things that are important for us to examine as we start talking about how do justice systems work around the world. Well, these are kind of the ideas that we're starting with. Next, we're going to look at some sample systems, just to give you a brief preview. Certainly, America is interesting, but we know so much about it, we're not really going to talk about America much. Instead, we're going to go back to our great-great-granddaddies and grandmas in England. We're going to talk about the English system, and then we're going to go across the channel to France, and we're going to look at the French system. The French system is very interesting. It's completely different than the English system. It comes from a different tradition. The German system we're going to look at, similar to the French system, but completely different in its own way. Some of the Scandinavian systems we're going to look at briefly, but they really are very similar to the German system. Although if you ask them, they'll say they're not Germanic, that they are Scandinavian. They come from this kind of Norse tradition that has a more of a socialistic viewpoint of taking care of almost the Maori, tribalism of the Navajo, promoting harmony. We're going to look at a couple of hybrid systems. We'll talk briefly about South Africa, mostly because there's some interesting stuff that's happened in South Africa in the last couple of years. But Japan as a hybrid system mostly. We're going to look at China as a socialist system, really the only big socialist system left, although we could maybe look at Cuba or Venezuela as an example of that. But China is the one that we're going to look at primarily. And then lastly, we're going to look at sacred law systems. Saudi Arabia, Iran are two really good examples, and we'll have some kind of case and things to discuss in both of those. So that's where we're going next. Thank you for listening, and I will see you within the discussion boards and within the classroom.